Thank you very much indeed, all of you, for joining us for this event. It's very exciting. I'm Lauren Taylor from Al Jazeera, and in a minute I'll introduce our fantastic panel here. But first I'd like to hand over to Saoirse O'Callaghan from the British Red Cross. She's the Head of Humanitarian Policy, and she's introducing the event on behalf of the organisers. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone, and on behalf of the 4 organisers of the event, the University of Exeter, the School of Oriental and African Studies, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and of course the British Red Cross, I'm delighted to warmly welcome you to tonight's panel discussion and debate. The discussion tonight forms part of a 2-day academic conference that is looking at the issue of forced displacement. And we're bringing together some of the best academic scholars, practitioners, and policymakers from a number of different disciplines to look at forced displacement over history in a number of different contexts and from a number of different angles to see what we can learn about forced displacement in the past to inform our responses and actions to today. And the British Red Cross has a very long history of working with refugees and forced displacement, having first worked in response to refugee displacement in 1897 during the war between Turkey and Greece. And we've continued to work on migration over many years, including responding to the Hungarian uprising in 1956, where we provided transportation, accommodation and support to what were 7,500 Hungarian refugees, and later during the Vietnam War to some 19,000 Vietnamese refugees who were resettled here to the UK. And today the British Red Cross is the largest voluntary organisation in the UK offering support to refugees and migrants internationally and in the UK. And our work involves support to migrants to ensure they don't fall into destitution, orientation through the asylum system, as well as some specialist support on anti-trafficking and family reunion. And we were one of a number of many organisations, many of whom are represented here today, who were part of advocating for young refugee migrants to be resettled and reunited with their families here in the UK. And we're very pleased to be offering support to the 300 young refugees who are now resettled from Calais. But before I pass you over to our panel, I just wanted to mention 1 or 2 things that we're learning from history. And I think the first is the very proud history that the UK has of welcoming and supporting refugees into the UK. And as I've just touched upon, often much greater numbers than we're receiving at the moment in the UK. But there are a lot of more negative lessons that we're also learning from history, not least the continuation to depict refugees and migrants as the other, and then to use them as political pawns, often in very difficult circumstances. We continue to see a very limited level of political interest to ensure that there is responsibility sharing in support of refugees and migrants. And too often we see that what should be legal protections offered to the most vulnerable amongst these communities are actually labels that are used to deny assistance and protection to what are often very vulnerable people on the move. And so before I pass you back to Lauren to welcome a very expert panel, I wanted to remind us all of some of the needs and the realities of people on the move. And so I'm going to show you a very short video that the British Red Cross has shown. So thank you and welcome.
كنا نطلع بس طلعنا شي مدة أسبوعين ما حدا تحملنا يعني ما عجقة يعني كتير ما مرتين ثلاث حجونا ما عنا يعني بيت ما عنا شي طول يعني نطلع عليه ولا عنا إمكانيات نستأجر بيت ونقعد يعني.
I left Syria 2 years ago. I go to Iraq, start working there يعني with my family, run away from Syria. But also in Iraq, work stop and they kick me out. So I don't have any place in the world accepting me.
Anh ba xa rồi đã nói chào cả đâu, wale, ba vào đất á, đó đi làm mà cả lại ai, còn tháo đó nhor còn nó thải ra thì chưa có được.
Dans mon pays, la vie est tellement dure, la politique n'est pas bonne. Je veux chercher ma vie ailleurs, pour faire ce que je veux, pour bien construire ma vie, c'est ça.
المخيم ملبظ ناموس واجد قناطش واجد باهي ما فيش نظافة ما في شيء نبي حمامات نبي مساعدات.
خیلی سخت بود مثلا خیلی سختی زیادی گذروندیم نزدیک بود توی دریا غرق بشیم بعد دیگه خیلی سختی کشیدیم خیلی تا خودمون اینجا رسوندیم.
Je n'ai aucune place pour aller. Je ne peux pas retourner dans mon pays parce que je courais beaucoup de risques pour arriver ici.
لا كردستاني هراق وهاتون وحسي كردستان نخوش بابوي ويسمان سفركين تان رقي سخت مامري وتاهاتون إيرا بوي بقين رجانك خوش.
We suffered too much to reach Greece. Then now we suffering again. I don't know what's waiting for us also in the future.
من به خاطر آینده بچه‌م اومدم مثلا درس بخونم مثل خودم بی سواد نشه. واقعا کشور ما الان جنگ واقعا ما نیاز به کمک داریم. اینجوری نیست که بگیم مثلا سوری بیشتر جنگ یا افغانستان کم اینجوری نیست.
Je peur qu'un jour ça tourne mal là où je vais aller faire ma vie et je peur que ça tourne mal d'autres choses que je ne pense pas puisse arriver donc c'est ça. C'est ça.
I am only thinking now about my children. I need their future. I am try asking, find somewhere accepting us as a citizen there and find a new life to live with my family and children. Just I want to live in peace.
Thank you very much, Saoirse, and also for that film, which really highlighted the individual stories behind the enormous numbers that are always talked about in the refugee crises. I'll introduce my panel now. Baroness Amos is the director of SOAS, and she was also previously Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the UN, and also she's been a Foreign Office Minister in the past and also Secretary of State for International Development. Kelly Clements is the UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, and she has a long history of dealing with refugees, also as the various jobs she's had, including Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration in the United States, and she's also been involved with UNHCR for a long time. And on the end here, we have Dominic Stillhart, who's the ICRC Director of Operations, and he's been in that position since July 2014. He's responsible for the strategic definition, conduct and review of humanitarian operations carried out by the organisation in 80 countries. So thank you very much for being with us. And here we have Abdulrahman Sharif, who is from the organisation which brings together a number of Somalia NGOs, and he is based in Somalia and Nairobi. So thanks very much indeed for our panellists, and I'd like to start with Kelly.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and thank you to the hosts, the organisers, for gathering us here today and for inviting us to join this distinguished panel. I'm happy to share the stage here with a number of very experienced individuals, and we're looking forward to a lively discussion, I think, particularly after we get through these initial comments. But I want to begin, because I know you all have been talking about history today, and you'll be talking more about history tomorrow, with the historical perspective of something called the New York Declaration, of which 193 countries joined together in September to sign and adopt at the UN General Assembly. and for us and what it means for the world's efforts to protect and assist the forcibly displaced. More importantly, what it means in terms of informing and improving our efforts to assist some of those people we've just seen on the film, a very great film by the British Red Cross, around the world. Thinking of the history behind today's displacement reminds me of how Eleanor Roosevelt once described a 1948 meeting of the UN Human Rights Commission, which was held at the former site of the League of Nations. I know this was the subject of another panel today. She said, "At first it seemed sad for me to go into that beautiful building, built with love and hope by nations who thought they had found the way to peace and understanding. Similarly, we meet today amidst inescapable reminders that forced displacement is an old and recurring problem. This problem is so pervasive that it evokes comparisons with the aftermath of World War II, when an estimated 30 million people remained displaced all over Europe. It's a daunting prospect, and if we look closer, it also points to the way forward. In direct response to the scale and the ferocity of the violence that characterized the war, the world's nations did something quite remarkable. They united. They overcame formidable differences to devise a set of rules designed to protect everyone's basic freedoms. This Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaimed that every individual and every organ of society shall strive to make this protection universal and effective. And it specified that these ideals should be pursued through progressive means, domestic and international. So it's easy to overlook the power of those words. Critics were quick at that time to point out that a mere declaration lacks binding legal force. Yet over the years, this declaration has proven its worth as a moral and a political blueprint for domestic, regional, and international systems, such as the International Refugee Protection Regime that we supervise. These systems have protected countless people around the world, and as envisioned, this protection they engender has developed progressively at multiple levels of governance and through the support of diverse stakeholders. Still, we know that many have suffered in spite of these principles, which are only as real as our efforts to achieve them. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights would have meant little without the broader systemic changes that happened at that time and followed the war. Here in Europe, for example, the Marshall Plan injected massive resources into reconstruction, and a push for regional unity helped secure the peace through economic and political cooperation. Elsewhere, determined struggles for independence led to the emergence of new nations and international consensus in support of self-determination. And at each stage of this progression, a principled vision of what should be done helped to guide things that actually were done. 2 months ago, this progression reached a powerful milestone in the New York Declaration. Faced with this global crisis of forced displacement, the world's nations reaffirmed the international system of human rights that grew from it. This time, nations declared their solidarity by committing to use all the means at our disposal to combat abuses, xenophobia, exploitation suffered by refugees and migrants. 1 day later, at the Leaders' Summit on Refugees, organized by President Obama, 52 governments and organizations came together and took important steps to put those words into action. It's significant that the language of that New York Declaration is all-encompassing. It covers the full cycle of forced displacement, from the root causes of flight to emergency response to solutions and protracted situations. Such breadth is important because the sheer magnitude and complexity of the problem today is stretching beyond the world's capacity to respond. Organizations like ours are struggling to reach and help so many people for extended periods of time. Despite unprecedented level of humanitarian funding, needs continue to exceed available resources, and this imbalance is clearly unsustainable. That's why the New York Declaration makes repeated reference to longer-term development. Dependence on humanitarian aid only prolongs poverty and exclusion. Building refugee self-reliance and resilience implies access to economic opportunities, services, and capital, and it also requires enabling policy environments, effective institutions that improve the lives of refugees and their hosts. UNHCR strengthened collaboration that we've had with the World Bank, for example, the UN Development Program over the past few years, emphasizes these common objectives. To make asylum work in practice, an even wider coalition of support is needed. Local, national authorities, international financial organizations, the private sector, civil society, like faith-based organizations, NGOs, and academics, all play a role. The Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which is outlined in the Declaration, presents a whole-of-society approach. The General Assembly tasked us to help develop this framework in collaboration with states and other UN agencies. And this process will also inform the development of a global compact, which we hope very much will be presented to the General Assembly and adopted in September of 2018. First and foremost, this framework requires a strong and inclusive consensus on the key elements of an effective response to large refugee movements. It makes clear that displacement is not just a humanitarian issue involving refugees, but one that affects its hosts as well. And as such, it places very strong emphasis on approaching displacement as a development challenge. Restoring resilience and dignity requires that long-term planning for solutions from the outset of a crisis and not as an afterthought. It outlines the respective contributions of countries of origin, hosts, and the international support required for such a response. Until more effective remedies are found to address the root causes of fragility and violence, many protracted refugee situations will remain unresolved, and we have to do more than wait to respond and resolve displacement. We must improve how we anticipate and prevent it. Prevention is inherently difficult, in part because the causes of forced displacement are diverse and interrelated. While armed conflict and persecution are prominent on this list, they emerge from a complex web of problems that many of you will know well. Poor governance, exclusionary politics, poverty, natural disasters, other environmental factors like climate change. Repeated cycles of conflict and violence are fueled by economies of resource extraction and the global arms trade. Statelessness and human trafficking are both causes and consequences of displacement. Root causes represent substantial obstacles to the realization of human rights. The Sustainable Development Goals target those very obstacles that threaten to force even more people from their homes in the future. And to meet these challenges, unilateral action is not enough. It takes concerted, multilateral, collective, and comprehensive action to see change. A truly comprehensive approach means recognizing all the factors that affect national development prospects and people's access in their country of origin or asylum. Developing countries host over 86% of the world's displaced. Their economies and their citizens bear the greatest economic and social burden. The global public good this effort represents deserves international support. And this can go beyond humanitarian and development support to include greater trade and investment opportunities. Identifying these connections allows us to imagine international solidarity in myriad forms. Bilateral trade negotiations, for example, can be opportunities to support countries of asylum. The reduction of traffic and non-tariff barriers in the developed world can help governments thousands of miles away afford greater investment in education and health. Consumer demand in North America for electronics or diamonds can impact the quality of labor rights or even the intensity of armed conflict or on another continent. International resolve to lower transaction costs for remittances can allow diaspora communities to better support the resilience of their counterparts back home. All these elements can potentially contribute to the resolution of global displacement and merit the attention of policymakers. With this knowledge in hand, the very far-reaching commitments of the New York Declaration look to reduce burdens in addition to sharing them more equitably. They demonstrate awareness of how our choices affect others in so many ways. Our shared responsibility for managing large movements of refugees and migrants is rooted in such awareness. And the challenges before us in today's troubled world are formidable. They hearken back to times of turmoil we believed we had overcome. Even so, the persistence of these challenges provides grounds for optimism. If we keep in mind how Eleanor Roosevelt's sad reaction to the former League of Nations gave way to encouragement, She realized that her activity was built upon those prior attempts at solidarity. In this way, our ongoing struggles with forced displacement reflect more than past failures. It also, as she put it, proves that the human spirit, human striving, is indestructible. It is set back, but it does not die. This spirit mirrors the courage and the ingenuity that refugees and migrants display each day in confronting the dangers and deprivations imposed on them. If we are to live up to the universal standards we have set for ourselves, if we are to act in genuine solidarity, we would all do well to follow their example. Thank you.
Kelly Clemens, thank you very much indeed. Abdurrahman Sharif.
Okay, I'm just going to talk a bit more about practical experience from Somalia, and obviously I think all of you would have heard about the recent announcement from the government of Kenya to close the Dadaab refugee camp. But just before that, just to reiterate what Kelly said, talking about 86% of refugees being in developing countries, and that deserves international support. I think if you look at the top 6 countries in Europe, in the Western Europe, that host refugees, and you compare that to the top 6 country in Africa, particularly, you'll see that the numbers are 3 times higher in Africa, and nobody talks about it. What you hear is just what's happening in Europe, and I think that's something that we collectively need to think about, is that there are others who are bearing the burden of this much more than Europe is. Just to talk about the Dadaab cases, I work on Somalia, and I've not visited Dadaab, but I've visited some of the return areas in Somalia, that are Baidoa, Mogadishu, Kismayo, and I think those who are in the regions, or those who have followed this issue, without any doubt will know that this was to be expected. For a number of years, everybody was talking about closure of Dadaab, and yet we have not prepared for it. And again, it comes, and Kenya announces that it's going to close Dadaab. I don't want to comment whether it's right or wrong, but just on the fact that it was expected, and the announcement has been reiterated many times, and it is expected to close at the end of November. Logistically, obviously no one is prepared for that. But what it has created, at least for the people living in Dadaab, is a state of fear and confusion. Refugees are making rushed decisions because they're concerned that they're going to be forcefully returned to Somalia, and that's not sustainable. Amongst those refugees who are in the Dadaab refugee camp, 60% are under the age of 18. And nearly actually 43% of those are school-aged children. For those of you who have heard about the phenomena of what's happening in Somalia, there's a big phenomena called tahrib. Tahrib is a phenomena where young people under the age of 30 go through perilous journeys to cross, to try to get to Europe. And in Somalia alone, you have 70% of the population that's under the age of 30. I just want to highlight to you is the reason why I want to highlight this is to highlight the complexity of this issue. It's not something simple that we can just find a solution and say we're going to find a solution from one day to the other. So Kenya announced it's going to close this camp. In this camp, there are 350,000 people, 50,000 probably Somali Kenyans. 70% of these come from an area in Somalia that's called Jubaland. And most want to return to urban centers like Kismayo in the south. In this urban center, there are already limited health facilities, limited education facilities, and limited basic services for the population. In this area, you have already 40,000 internally displaced people. And not only that, is that all over Somalia, we're talking about 2 million, between Somalia and outside, 2 million displaced communities. 1 million of those are actually IDPs inside Somalia. If I to give you an example of what's happening inside Somalia is in a city like Mogadishu, which is the capital, in the first, actually in 2015, Mogadishu was one of the fastest growing cities in the world, among top 5, top 6, interestingly. But in the first 6 months between January and June 2015, 100,000 people, IDPs, were evicted from where they were staying. And that's the reality of Somalia today. I don't want to talk too much about the case of Somalia and so on, because although one of my biggest concerns is that whereas everybody is thinking about returns at the moment, people are forgetting that Somalia still has a big humanitarian caseload. About 5 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. At the moment, we're talking about droughts in Somaliland, in Puntland, in Lower Juba. We're talking about a conflict that has erupted in a town called Galkayo, which has created further displacement. And then for the first time ever in Somalia, ISIS taking over one specific town, village of northern Puntland, which has created again further displacement. But what I want to concentrate on is I think how we can respond more effectively to this complex and protracted situation like is the case in Somalia. First of all, I think on the Dadaab case, we're talking about 3 settlements options. One is voluntary repatriation back to Somalia, the other one is local integration, or the third one is resettlement in another country like the US or in Europe and so on. But the way we see it in Somalia, at least from the NGO colleagues and the NGO side, is that return is not a solution. Reintegration is. And that actually what we call durable solutions, which is creating, longer-term solutions for displaced, about creating longer-term solutions for displaced communities. It's about a multi-stakeholder approach. And as Kelly said, it is a collective responsibility, and we all have to work together to address it. But when we talk about collective responsibility, it's not just humanitarians, but it's also humanitarian actors, development actors, peace-building actors, human rights actors, because those people who are going back to Somalia want their rights to be respected. And if there is no legal framework protecting that, then they'll face more difficulties when they go back. But it's also about what role can the government play. And the government, I'd say, at least in Somalia, is in a very difficult situation, because although it has no capacity to manage these returns, it will never say to its people, we can't welcome you back home. Mm-hmm. But I think not to forget that this also has to be, an integrated approach. When I mean integrated approach, is an approach that looks at not only people going back from Dadaab, but also people who are displaced already in Somalia, and also host communities who are going to live with these communities. When I was in Kismayo about a month ago, or over a month ago, interviewing some of the people who have returned, one of the most interesting aspects you could see is that actually the kids of these people coming from Dadaab were better educated than the people that were already in Kismayo. But also that whilst we're doing all of this, it's important to have a strong channel of communication to inform reintegration in the best way possible, so that people are well informed. Again, I refer to these people I interviewed in Kismayo about a month ago, and they say we were told that we'll have good packages, our kids will receive education, we'll have health facilities and so on. And so there's a lot of misinformation going on, and nobody is to blame. But one of the biggest challenges, I guess, in this case, I think we face in the issue of Dadaab and returns, is that whereas we all, I think, disagree that these returns should happen and they are happening, but we can't stand there and just watch. We have to find ways of addressing this problem and dynamic. And just to close, I think what we're asking for is not to say Dadaab needs to be opened or needs to be closed. What we're asking for is to say, if you're planning to close Dadaab, do it in a more paced way. Let us think about the ways to do that and take more time about that. And I think the thinking element is what needs to happen before taking hasty decisions. Thank you.
Rahman Sharif, thank you very much indeed. I'd like to bring in Dominic Stillhart from the ICRC now.
Thank you. Lorraine, and good evening to all of you. My mother tongue is German, or Swiss German, as we like to say in our part of Switzerland. And in German we have a word that is called Heimat, and that word actually transcends the root of its meaning, which is something like home or homeland. It is actually a deep sense, or it conveys a deep sense of spatial, social, emotional, and cultural belonging that amounts to safety and security. And today we are here to talk about people who have lost that safety and security because they were forced to flee as a consequence very often of violence. We at the ICRC, we have about 15,000 staff in over 80 countries all around the world. And we see very often firsthand the suffering of the people. We witness the personal human tragedies and see the scale of destructions in some of these frontline countries where very destructive conflicts are taking place. And the 65 million people who are forcibly displaced, they have not just decided one morning to pack their bags and to embark on a journey. These are people who were forced to flee because of violence, and they are vulnerable. They are vulnerable to violence that leads them to flee. And I think it's really important that we keep that in mind in the discussion that we have this evening. They flee from Syria, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from Nigeria or Central America. But at the same time, we talk about all these millions forcibly displaced, but there are individual tragedies behind each and every one of these people and families who are forcibly displaced. I was, like the man that I met in Nogales last year. Nogales is at the US-Mexican border, and I met this man because I actually traveled the migration trail from the US all the way down to Central America. And I met this man in a migrant shelter, and I asked him to tell me his story, and he said, he was from El Salvador, where in the capital he was running a car workshop, and every month he had to pay $90 protection money to one of the criminal gangs in his neighborhood. That was okay as long as his workshop was working well, but the economy was going down and he couldn't pay that amount anymore because he couldn't feed his family. And he asked for a discount, which the gang was simply not ready to give him. They threatened him. He couldn't pay more. One day he came home from his workshop, as he told me, and he found his wife killed on his doorstep. And that was the time when he decided to leave. So this man, from one day to the next, he said, it's enough, I cannot stay here. And then I asked him about his kids, and he said, I have 2 kids. I have one son. He's 23. 5 years ago, he decided to leave because he was, this armed gang, this criminal gang wanted to recruit him, and he didn't want to join them. And because he was afraid for his life, he also left. But the father, this man that I was talking to, hadn't heard from him in the past 5 years. So he was sure that he was killed on the migrant trail. And he had one daughter left, and that is when he started to cry. And he said, I left her behind with the parents of my wife. So these are the type of tragedies that force people to flee. And as my colleagues already said before, many of the people who decide to flee, they never even reach the shores of Europe or the United States. The large majority actually 2/3, 40 million, more than 40 out of these 65 millions, they are internally displaced. You know the numbers in Syria, more than 6 million displaced. Some of the numbers were already mentioned by my colleagues. And I think it is important that we just collectively realize, as Abdurrahman and Kelly already said, the brunt of the burden in terms of forced displacement is borne by the very country that are affected by conflict and by neighboring countries. And there are remarkable stories of generosity and resilience in these very countries. Now, the question that we were asked here on the panel is what more we can do to protect people who are forcibly displaced. Kelly, you were speaking about the New York Declaration. I also think this is a historic declaration. It's definitely a very critical declaration because states indeed pledge to make life better for migrants and refugees by working together, taking in refugees and asylum seekers and giving money to countries struggling with the pressure additional people place on their infrastructure and resources. Now, from our point of view, whilst we would have liked to see the plight of internally displaced people getting more attention in this conference, we very much, or in this declaration, we very much also appreciate the fact that a lot of attention was also on the root causes. And you said that, Kelly, with states really playing renewed emphasis on the need to address the root causes of migration. And this brings me right to the relevance of international humanitarian law in addressing the root causes of large migration movement. It is actually not just the brutal reality of warfare that makes people flee. It is also the repeated violations of the laws of war, of international humanitarian law, such as targeted attacks on civilians, civilian infrastructure and hospitals, siege warfare that we see very often today, that is depriving the population of means to survive, that creates these unacceptable living conditions that force people to flee. And the argument that I'm making here is that greater respect for these very laws of war would actually go a long way in addressing some of the root causes of forced displacement. And there is also no doubt in my mind that states can do more to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. We are very often asked by politicians how. What can we do? How can we better ensure respect for international humanitarian law? And I'd just like us to look at the Middle East, where more than 20 states today, as we speak, are either directly or indirectly involved in the various conflicts in Syria and Iraq and Yemen. Many of these states are today acting in support of either state or non-state armed groups, and while certain forms of support for both states and armed group partners, including the provision of arms and ammunition, are particularly risky, state support to parties to armed conflict also create significant opportunities to strengthen the respect for international humanitarian law. States that provide support are actually in a particularly strong position to influence the parties' behavior and to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law. For instance, very practically speaking, because it is one thing is to say respect international humanitarian law, but very practically speaking, providing medical evacuation services to a non-state armed group that otherwise lacks such means could mitigate the risk to medical structures. These might otherwise be exposed to attack due to the presence of wounded enemies. Or take the train and equip initiatives in which many states are involved. These initiatives must absolutely incorporate the training for international humanitarian law into all combined training exercises, including through practical training scenarios. There are a whole range of very practical recommendations that we are making today to these very states that are involved in either directly or indirectly in the conflict in the Middle East. And the bottom line should really be that there should be no support without compliance to international humanitarian law. Support to parties to armed conflict should come with clear accountabilities, and this requires, obviously, the establishment or the investment into effective oversight and accountability mechanisms, including appropriate sanctions when violations occur. To conclude, I think we really have no choice but to invest in renewed diplomatic efforts to end conflict, and whilst conflict is raging, to alleviate its impact through better respect for international humanitarian law, to invest in sustained financial efforts to assist communities that are affected by conflict, and to invest in increased humanitarian efforts to protect vulnerable migrants on their journey. And finally, to invest in substantial political efforts to give these people who are forcibly displaced the opportunity to build new lives, to enable them to take charge of their own lives, and to work and raise their children in dignity. In other words, to give every person a chance to build a new Heimat, either temporary or permanently.
Dominic Stillhard, thank you very much indeed. And now Baroness Amos.
Lauren, thank you very much. And much of what I've got to say really has been captured by what's been said before. But no surprise to anyone here that I'm going to focus very much on the politics of all of this. And my starting point is really something that Abdurrahman said, which is that, you know, in the last couple of years, we've really here in Europe begun to understand or appreciate the scale of the crisis, because particularly of what's been going on in Syria and the arrival of Syrian refugees on the border of Europe. But of course, it goes much, much wider than that. And there's been a huge disconnect over many, many years between the reality of what's been happening on the ground in terms of forced displacement within countries and refugee flows between countries and what has been happening in countries affected by conflict. And particularly the point that has been made, I think, by everybody on this panel about the huge impact on neighbouring countries, which themselves are extraordinarily vulnerable and fragile. But very often there's absolutely no visibility in relation to that. And I think the one statistic that I want to quote, I think really tells a very important story, which is that the average time that someone is displaced by conflict is now a staggering 17 years. Well, if that's the average, it means that there are a lot of people who've been displaced for much, much longer than that. And of course, there are many people who are displaced many, many times. I saw this in my 5 years at the UN. I remember going to Sudan and visiting Darfur and feeling absolutely powerless at the reality that I saw on the ground there, with so many people living in the camps in Darfur, young people who had been born there and were now teenagers, people completely de-skilled because there was absolutely nothing for them to do, a government living in a country with a government that had no interest in them whatsoever, where the most that we were saying as international organizations was that they needed to return to their places of origin. Well, they were never going to do that. The point that Abdurrahman made about urbanization is absolutely right, that people, even with living in a camp, people had become used to a certain degree of receipt of services, even though in our terms they were absolutely basic and terrible, and the communities from which they had come had nothing at all in terms of service provision. But the other thing that we were not admitting was that we had created a sort of sense of dependency because there was no employment for people. There was no sense that people could look after their own families, you know, the kinds of things that we take absolutely for granted. So we were creating a sort of cycle that was very difficult to break. I remember going to the DRC and seeing what was happening in the east of the country in the Kivus. We talked about Somalia and Dadaab, and I will never forget one of the trips that I made to Dadaab, and I happened to see a woman who was standing looking sort of completely dazed and lost, and I went up to her with an interpreter and just wanted to hear her story. And it was the most appalling story. She had walked from Somalia. She had started that journey with her 4 children, and she arrived in Dadaab by herself. Her 4 children died on the way. Now it's not an unusual story. It happens to millions of people. The Central African Republic, Iraq, Syria I've mentioned, what's been happening to the Palestinians, South Sudan. And the most that we are saying to countries that are bordering these countries, the likes of Kenya, Tanzania, Pakistan, Chad, Lebanon and Jordan is, and I was part of this, we would go along as UN officials, basically pleading with governments to keep their borders open and having very little to offer them by way of support. And I remember on about my 3rd or 4th visit to Lebanon, the Prime Minister at the time looking at me and basically saying, we can't do this anymore. And the only thing that got us as an international community to sort of jump up and down and try to do anything was when there was a threat that they were going to close the border. Well, what kind of world are we living in when the kind of support that we need to give to those neighboring countries is completely missing? And that the only time when it becomes a crisis is when it hits the border of Europe. And we actually let in a pathetic number of people. Look at what has happened to Angela Merkel and what's happened in Germany because the border was opened up and Germany received 1 million people. The vitriol, the impact politically on Angela Merkel and her party, and the dissent that she had in relation to that, and so many leaders from across Europe being terribly smug and basically saying, well, she should never have let them in the first place. So there is a huge, in my view, political failure and lack of global leadership. One, to make the efforts necessary to try to sort out these conflicts, because there are way too many proxies. Dominic talked about the proxies in relation to what's happening in the Middle East, but it is everywhere. Let's not forget that. There are entrenched positions, particularly political differences, between the permanent members of the Security Council. I saw that for myself when we were trying, at the very basic level, to get a humanitarian resolution on Syria. It took us 2 years to get the first resolution. And you would think that in relation to a major humanitarian crisis that we watched unravel before our very eyes, that actually there would have been a greater sense of impetus and need. There is a total, in my view, lack of accountability. And I left the UN and my job at the UN actually obsessed. I became obsessed with this issue of accountability. Because what are the sanctions and penalties for countries that don't abide by the international resolutions, international humanitarian law, international refugee law that they've signed up to? We've seen a national domestic discourse in countries like the United Kingdom evolve, which is anti any sense of enabling and allowing refugees into the country. We've become very inward-looking, very defensive. We talk about our history of tolerance and so on, but that is part of our history. It's not part of our here and now. And I have to say, and this obviously this is not about me, but I remember on the morning after the Brexit vote, and it wasn't so much about the Brexit vote, but what had been unleashed in the run-up to that vote, feeling for the first time, and I've been here in the United Kingdom since I was 9 years old. I consider myself to be British, and I've been through, and my family have been through and seen discrimination, but nothing on the scale that we're seeing leveled against refugees. And I remember waking up that morning and feeling a real sense of not belonging. It's the first time I felt I had no country and that I had nowhere to go. Well, if I felt that just as the result of a vote in a referendum, what about those millions of people who have been forced into displacement within their countries and have been forced to flee their countries, and where there are very few countries that are actually welcoming them with open arms? And we have a huge amount of support that we need to give to those countries that are welcoming and are prepared to take on these responsibilities. I think that we need to recognize that some of the protections that now exist within international humanitarian law, we would not be able to get now if we were trying to negotiate them now. But our challenge is that they are too narrow to deal with the current reality that we have on the ground. I don't have an answer to this, but I do think it's something that we need to address together, because we're expecting a level of resilience from individuals and from countries that we have absolutely no right to expect. I think that from our colleagues around the table, we've heard about the complexities of all of this. We have multi-mandated organizations, mandates that have been given historically. As I said, I don't think that they address the modern reality, but we're also not sufficiently joined up in terms of the way that we think about the solutions to deal with the current complexity. Kelly mentioned what she called the moral and political blueprint which the Universal Declaration has given us, and then she also talked about the New York Declaration. Yes, of course, the New York Declaration is important. It's particularly important, I think, as an indication of direction of travel. But we all know that the implementation of something like the New York Declaration is going to take years when actually we need action now. Again, this is not something that I have an answer to, but we are watching an everyday reality with a level of inaction that I think is staggering. I think we need to look at different models, because I think that there are limited protections under current legislation. I think we need to look at how we assure greater accountability. We need to think about how we make the international protections that we have meaningful. And Dominic talked about the targeting, for example, of schools and hospitals, forcing children to become combatants. I think that there are some areas that we can patently agree on because they are so clear and so obvious, where we shame our countries actually to take greater action and to be more responsible. I also think that we need to be much tougher on countries which are themselves in conflict, where, for example, a government will say that no support should go to an area of a country where opposition groups are operating, or where they are not in a majority. We actually let that happen. Again, what are we going to do about this? So I'm afraid, more questions than answers, but I really think that given the kind of audience we have tonight, that we could really think together on how we can get some examples and some way forwards on some of these really difficult and complex questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Abdurrahman Sharif, from the Director of Somalia NGO Consortium, Dominic Stillhart, Director of Operations from ICRC, Kelly Clements, UN Deputy High Commissioner for Refugees, and Baroness Amos, Director of SOAS. Thank you very much indeed to our panel.